Hello and welcome to another Coffee with Developers. I'm here joined today by Kilian Valkhof, and we know each other for decades from conferences and stuff, and then we haven't talked for years, right? So, how are you doing?
I'm very good. Yeah, yeah. It's probably like the early frontiers
Yeah.
conferences that we first met, right? That's a long time ago.
Yeah, and if you in the audience have not heard of Frontiers conferences, they were kind of amazing because they were very much web focused and web standards focused conferences in Amsterdam all the time. At the same time, we had PariWeb, which was kind of similar as well. And before that, we had Ad Media in London. Like these
hmm
were all the heydays of these like web development days where we talked about how about using standards. Which brings me to the topic that I wanted to talk to you about. You wrote an interesting article, which was also in the newsletter last Friday, um, about APIs in the browser nowadays. A lot
hmm
of them not being APIs that are browser or web standards APIs anymore, but actually dependent on the company. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. The reason I wanted to write this article is I built my own browser, Polypane. We can talk about that later. But that is built on Chromium. And Chromium, like all the other browsers, has an API to get the user's location, the geolocation API. And that looks just like any other bit of JavaScript API. So you have like document.getElement by ID, and you have navigator.geolocation. So it looks like any API. But it's not available in my browser by default, and it is in Chrome, in Firefox, in Safari, etc. So I was getting questions about that, and then every time I explained people why, and this is to like developers that have been building websites for like 5, 10, 20 years as well, they were very surprised. Uh, Not necessarily because of what I told them, but because they hadn't themselves like thought through that. So what the geolocation API does is ideally it asks the operating system, give me the user's physical location. And the operating system runs on hardware with a GPS tracker in it or a GPS receiver, and it can query GPS and get a value back. But of course, not all devices have a GPS receiver built in. Um, so what the browser then does is it just sends your IP to Google's geolocation service and asks the Google geolocation service, where is this IP located? And then the service does whatever it does, and it sends back the geolocation to the browser. In other words, you're sending user data to Google or to Apple, um, or or to Microsoft, and then getting results back. But of course, because it feels like just any other JavaScript API, people didn't realize that that was what was happening. And the reason it doesn't work in my browser in Polypane is because, of course, Google gets to use Google services for absolutely nothing in Google Chrome. Like they have the super secret unlimited usage key built into Google Chrome, but every other browser essentially needs to pay Google to use that service. Because it's a service they offer and they like to make money, apparently. And so to use it in my browser, I ask people to add their own Google API key to make those API calls. And so this surprised a lot of people. But there's actually quite a lot of APIs in browsers that feel like they just exist, like, interacting with the DOM or uh, doing console.logging or whatever, but that are actually like calling out to these services that these same very large companies offer.
Well, it's the same with like the lookup. Like when you go online and you're offline, the error page that actually says that you're offline is different from Microsoft to Google to others. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, when you do that lookup, if you're online, there's like an error page saying MS HTML whatever, and Google in Chrome does another one. There's a lot of these things that actually are necessary. And I mean, reverse geo lookup. There was a MaxMind was an API that did that for free to a certain level as well. And in developer tools, you can simulate a location as well. So
Mm-hmm.
if people don't want to put their key in, they could do it in the developer tools to actually say like, I'm in Berlin right now,
Yeah.
which is always a good thing to get like cheaper tickets on like cheap airlines as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
it's interesting to see that like when I'm offline sometimes. I go to trains or I'm sitting at a doctor's appointment, and then I realize just how useless browsers have become when you're not online anymore. And it's kind of a worrying idea. Of course, the idea of a browser is that it shows you online content, so it
Mm-hmm.
expects you to be there. But the functionality of it, like the, as you said, calling home and finding information, sending information of your users to somewhere else, is something that has become more and more over the years. And then
Yeah.
now with the AI on device things, and like with the AI browsers and agents that serve for you and stuff, we're really getting back into a world where we're dependent on the operating system and the companies for browsing. And this is
Mm-hmm.
exactly the opposite of what we wanted for decades
Yeah.
now. When Firefox came out, it was basically breaking the monopoly of Microsoft as the browser, and also Netscape as the company that didn't want to support it anymore. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a great documentary called Code Rush, which actually is about how Firefox was built.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that for years, and now we're going back happily to being just dependent on one company.
Yeah.
Now, as a browser maker, you are at the forefront of getting requests from people that you cannot fulfill.
Mm-hmm.
So, how often does that happen? Was that geolocation the one thing, and why did people use the geolocation stuff? Was it for showing ads or showing cookie consent banners, or?
I usually don't really inquire like why people need specific things because, um, like you said, with Firefox, uh, we sort of like grew this industry into thinking that whatever you put on a web page, like it's incidentally shown by a browser, but that doesn't really matter because we're all using standards and the standards are adopted by everyone the same way. So there's just APIs that or function calls that exist that work, and it doesn't really matter in which browser you call them because they just like magically do the thing because that's like the standards contract that we've decided on with each other. And that's true up to an extent, but that causes people to not like another good example is like the differentiation between a browser API and a JavaScript API. Like that's a pretty important difference that like doesn't matter at all for your day-to-day web development work. Like is the API that you're using, is it bit or specified by like the W3C or by ECMA, or is it like some thing a browser vendor decided on like 2 decades ago and now everyone just uses the same API calls for convenience? Like there's all these different bits in the browser that as a developer you don't really have to care about because they just work and they work well enough cross browser cross platform. And so, whatever you use geolocation for, or whatever you use the text to speech API for, it doesn't really matter because it just feels like, it exists in the browser. So obviously it's sort of magically there. I think that's how a lot of people feel about it. And that's why it's also so surprising when you write it all out, like all these APIs, what are they actually doing? Um, because if I had asked you in general, at some point, like how does the geolocation API work? Like at some point, you would have gone, well, and I guess if there's no GPS receiver in this device, it would do something with the IP or the MAC address, or look at the Wi-Fi network. So developers, they can like rationally deduct what's happening, but because you don't see that, like the API doesn't tell you, oh, this device doesn't have GPS, I'm gonna do a fetch request now. That doesn't happen. The browser takes care of that in some piece of code that you don't see. So it's completely abstracted away from you.
Mm.
And that's what makes it, so I call it insidious in the article, which is a bit strong, but that's what you do in an article. You have to play it up a little bit, but it is sort of like surprising to a lot of people in a way that like they don't expect things to work this way, even though they can deduce that it should obviously work this way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we came up with a lot of APIs that give us more access to the device, like in Firefox OS, we came up with the web USB stuff. Then we have
Mm-hmm.
things like notifications. Then you have things like installing from the browser. And we always set these like, oh, here's an open standard. And then we realized the security implications of it and like how much of a nightmare that was. So all of those became like only for HTTPS environments, and you
Mm-hmm.
have to have a course header and all these things. So it seems like the more we brought the web standards to a native world where you have access to outside
Mm-hmm.
devices, the more tricky it became to implement them. So it feels like in native environments, people don't even bother. They just say like, okay, make it for me, do it for me. But
Yeah.
in browsers, we're stuck in this world where we have to tell the user that something is happening and ask them to say yes or no, and
Mm-hmm.
then have a try catch around everything that we do because the user might say no to it. And do you think that that is a problem that people don't embrace web development because of that kind of like UX nightmare?
Well, I hope not. And I think it's more so the other way. So the places where the browser goes, hold up, are you sure you want like this website to have access to this stuff, is actually pretty nice, because the opposite is like any executable you install on Windows or Mac uh, outside of their respective app stores has access to everything on your device
Mm.
by default. So there's a yeah. So I have an executable that I distribute for Mac, Windows, and Linux. So I occasionally get questions like, well, how secure is this, and if I open my website in it, etc. And it's like, well, that's not something you should care about. Like, you're installing an executable, and like, even if that executable would be open source, there's no way for you to really inspect or know upfront what it's going to do to your operating system. And like, we do pretty well. Like, there's not a lot of apps that get installed that instantly nuke your hard drive or something. But it's something people don't, and even developers, they don't do like a risk analysis for every npm package they install.
Oh no. Yeah.
They should probably, but like, I should probably. I also don't do that. Um, but yeah, so like, in terms of risk, like, every day we take far more risks than is really than is possible in the browser. Um, and I think it's good that in the browser things are becoming more open. Where one thing that's really interesting is like the file system API,
Hmm.
where you can say like, this web page has access to this folder, and it can interact with the entire folder, like create files, delete files, change files, but only in that folder. And that means you can get a pretty near native experience handling files, because you can just like press Command S, and it'll save the file on disk in the way you expect it to work in any other application. But it's still gated in a way that user understands.
The file system API used to be a simulated file system, right? In the past, it was, I think it was like
Mm-hmm.
a SQLite database that was basically simulating a file system. But this is where all the agentic browsers come in now, basically, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people do like the AI. AI-based editors. A lot of people fork Visual Studio Code and then turn off all the security settings so that their AI agent has access to every
Yeah.
command line interface and to every Unix command on your machine.
Hmm.
And it just worries me that people are just like for convenience, or they think like that's fine. That's
Hmm.
exactly what malware used to do, and now
Yeah.
we call it an agentic browser, and people are happily installing it.
So I don't necessarily think that like an agentic code editor is much worse than like the npm install and post install commands that we had a decade ago and still have. Like they're roughly the same risk, except of course like the AI stuff is by definition non-deterministic. So like npm could deterministically like delete your whole hard drive or delete the entire database, and AI will do it at random, which is more exciting. Um, and that's where the sparkles come from.
Yes.
But yeah, so and that works both ways, right? So if you look at AI browsers, like it terrifies me that someone would install an AI browser and then log into their banking account. Like just logging in is enough for that thing to do anything it wants, with no deterministic behavior.
Yeah, we always hope that everything is sorted, but then you see so many companies doing plain text data, password storage and like sending
Mm-hmm.
things over the URL, and it's just like basic security things that any audit in a company would stop. Is basically like, okay, because we've got to ship fast, let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a bit about your story. What does Polypane do? Which gap in the browser market do you
Mm-hmm.
fill with your product?
Yeah, sure. So to talk about that, we have to go back a little bit. I used to build websites for small and large companies in the Netherlands and worldwide, and I did that for a very long time. I started like roughly 2 decades ago. Um, so when I started, there was no responsive design, there was no iPhone, there was no iPad. Um, we did standards, but like sort of everyone thought we were crazy for doing that. Um, but you know, if you stick with it long enough, now it's just the norm. Um, and what I had also been doing during that time, so I was building websites for people, and then the iPhone came around, and we started doing like iPhone web apps, and then the iPad came around, and we started doing iPad apps. But I was always building like other tools for myself, uh, either in JavaScript or in Python, just to make my life a little bit easier to automate all the stuff that annoyed me. So one of the tools that I built, um, like 16 years ago, no, 18 years ago now, is called Trimage. And all it is like it's a Python app, and you drag your images in there, and it losslessly minifies them. Because that's something that you have to do all the time when you're handling images, often from customers, where they take photos with their camera and they upload the huge photos and they say, put these on the website. You have to resize them, but then they still contain a lot of crap that you don't need, like metadata and stuff. And there's a bunch of command line tools to do that, but doing that in a script or whatever is annoying. You just want to grab the folder with the images and process it. So I built that, and I still use it like at least once a week. It's included in Ubuntu, so I don't even have to build it. I can just install it, which is pretty cool. Um, but yeah, so tools like that I was always building, and then at some point, responsive design came along, and then at some point I switched my company over from designing in Photoshop to designing in Sketch, which was really nice. And then one thing Sketch did that Photoshop didn't was it had artboards, so you could design your new site, and then you could have your mobile and your desktop designs and your tablet designs side by side in this zooming canvas. And that was a really nice experience because you could very quickly compare and contrast between the different sizes and make sure that you're not like accidentally forgetting an entire section on the mobile design or whatever. But then I went back to the browser to implement these designs, and I was back to looking at a single square or a single rectangle that I had to drag to resize. And that annoyed me so much that I came up with an app to deal with that, which at the start was essentially just, what if there's an app with an address bar and 3 iframes at different sizes? And that's the birth of Polypane. So it started as a way for me to make responsive development easier, to make sure that I didn't forget to check things, because the update loop for when you're working on a design in a regular browser is pretty terrible, because you're building something and it works on desktop, and then you resize it to mobile and you see something is broken and you fix it there. But then because of the way much of CSS works, you then have to go back to the desktop design to make sure that you didn't accidentally break something there with the fixes you did for mobile. So the loop is really annoying and there's a lot of repetition, and I handled that poorly. And so that was a decade ago. So I started Polypane in 2015 as this fun little side project. It was just to get over my annoyance. But then at some point, I started comparing my hours, like projects where I used Polypane and projects where I didn't use Polypane. And it turned out I was 60% more efficient using Polypane. So that's when I decided that, maybe it's time to put a little bit more effort into it. So in 2019, I switched careers and I'm no longer a web developer. I'm now a browser vendor, which is fun to say. Like there's a list of browser vendors. There's Google, there's Microsoft, there's Apple, and there's Kilian. And nowadays, Polypane grew into like essentially the tool that I wished I had for any task that is related to building high quality websites. So there's, of course, a lot of tooling for responsive design, but there's also tooling for like testing different media queries. So you can have a light mode and a dark mode side by side without changing your entire operating system or your browser theme. There's tons of accessibility features above and beyond what you can do in other tools, because if you're the browser, you get access to a lot more of the page that you can inspect and reason about. Performance features where it will automatically track like your web core vitals over all the different sizes that you inspect. And it just makes building websites really nice, because as you build your website, in whatever tool you use, so whether you use a code editor or you have like a WordPress theme editor or whatever, in Polypane, you can see your website in all its different permutations as you work. So you can have like 20 different mobile devices, and then a dark mode and a light mode and a forced color mode and a reduced motion mode and a mode where like your network is really slow. And you can see all of this in one overview. So if there's anything wrong at any part, you get to see that as you're working on that feature, rather than like a week later or a month later when someone reports an issue. Because by that time, you've forgotten what you were doing then. Maybe you moved on to a different project. Maybe you don't even have it installed on your device anymore. You have to download it and set up the database again. And it's very annoying. Like the quicker that feedback loop is, the more fun you have as a developer. And that's what Polypane lets you do.
Mm-hmm. I worked on the developer tools in Chromium for Edge, and then we brought back to the core as well. A lot of the features that you talked about, I showed in internal hack days, and we actually had all of these things, but we couldn't ship it as Microsoft because it was too heavy. and basically Chrome wouldn't allow us to actually put it into developer tools because it was 1 meg more data than when the developer. That was before we put AI agents into everything and downloaded 3 gigabyte databases in the background. There was another browser called Sizzy or Sissy back then that did similar thing as well. And I love that a
So
lot of people came.
Polypane predates that pretty
Okay,
significantly.
okay. Because it was interesting that a lot of people came up with the same solution space and the issues. Other people do like scripts for that to do like a headless browser that does it and just does
Hmm.
screenshots for you. There's like
Yeah.
all kind of things like that as well. But I find it fascinating to that you fully went on that. So
Hmm.
is Polypane just you, or do you have other people working with you? Do you have freelancers work with you? Do you have open source contributors to your product, or
So
is it just
Polypane,
it dies with you?
Polypane isn't open, and that's I do have a mortgage. I do have to well. I hire freelancers whenever that's needed, but it's mostly me building everything, doing customer support, getting coffee for the entire team, stuff like that.
Mhm. How many customers, if you want to say that, like how many people are that much of a dedicated developer that they're actually using that? What are your download numbers, right?
So I don't post those, but I have I can say tens of thousands of users.
Okay. So that's pretty cool. So, I mean, it also feels like every time you release a new one, you're like, oh my God, I hope I didn't break anything to people. I mean, I get that with my newsletter, but like releasing software is a different issue. How many times do
I've
you run into the issue of operating systems changing their permission model? Because a lot of people started not releasing things on Mac as binaries because they didn't want to
mhm.
pay to Apple to actually be a signed product. Is this
Yeah,
something that you
so
have to chase?
I do occasionally. So I've gotten pretty good at releasing. So I can decide to release now and have a new version available for all platforms in like an hour. And that, out in the world and for people to automatically update their app. So it like updating doesn't really scare me that much. Of course, I have to knock on wood now because this means that the next update will go wrong in some way. But like I can fairly confidently release new versions, and I do like roughly once a month. So there's an update once a month with new features, etc. Uh, and sometimes there's weird stuff. Um, Luckily enough, or unluckily enough, like when I started back in 2019, I started getting the app ready in March of 2019. And then, of course, I postponed getting an Apple developer account because they cost money. So I was only going to do that like at the moment I needed it. So I did that at the end of April. But this was right around the time where Apple started setting up their notarization thing, where you had to upload your executable to Apple, even if it wasn't for the App Store. They would sign it in some way and then send it back. And if you didn't have that, you would not be able to open it on any Mac without doing like holding Option and then right clicking and like stuff you don't want to explain to users. So I thought I was good because that was only going to be a requirement at the end of May, except for all the newly created developer accounts starting from April 1st. So I was actually like one of the first people that had to figure out how to notarize Electron apps. And I figured that out and released articles about that. And to this day, I still get emails thanking me for that article uh, because, like, I was the first one to figure out which parts of the app you had to sign or not explicitly not sign, because that would then break if you had a signed installer. That would Apple wouldn't be able to deal with that. Bunch of very annoying things. And of course, back then, like notarizing something took well over an hour. So it wasn't a nice fast feedback loop like in Polypane. It took like a solid week of trying and debugging and trying until I had the magic configuration that worked. Um, but since then, Mac's pretty good. Windows is pretty good because it's like mostly a free for all. Like there's some weird stuff on ARM devices, but there's like 3.5 people in the world that use Windows on ARM, and they're all miserable. So uh, Polypane not being perfect there, like it fits the pattern. The annoying thing now is that there's a lot of stuff happening on Linux with regards to permissions, and the annoying part there is that it's very like Linux itself, it's very distributed. So it used to be you had deps for Debian and Ubuntu, you had RPM for Fedora and all the other things, and then everyone on Arch just wanted to build it themselves. Um, but now you have AppImage, and AppImage is supposed to be portable, but it very frequently changes its permission model. So you need sort of an app image installer / handler to make sure that app images have enough permissions to run, but not too much to like destroy everything you do. And then there's Snap for newer Ubuntu's, which result in much slower startup times. So Firefox on Linux is really slow to start because it's a Snap, which is an ironic name now that I say that out loud. But they have like a really strict security model, and they so strict that it's almost where it's essentially impossible for me to release a snap because they also want your full source, etc., to be uploaded to Ubuntu server, which of course, if you have an open source package, you're like, yeah, it's on GitHub, big deal. But if, like me, you depend on your code or on your source for a living, then you don't want to upload that to any random company just because they want to have an installer that's, I don't even know why they need it. But that's Snap, and then there's also Flatpak, which has similar things, though I don't think they require the source code, but they have like very granular permissions that you need to set. And then they become really difficult to set because Polypane is built on Chromium, so it has the same rendering engine as Chrome. But Chromium itself is sort of a moving target with regards to which permissions it has in relation to the operating system. And of course, Chrome has enough people to figure that out. But it's something I rather not have to deal with. So there's a lot going on there, and I want to provide more Linux installers. Right now, it's just like Debian and AppImage. But because the AppImage runs everywhere, it's mostly fine.
So it's interesting to see that, like, when I worked on developer tools, I realized one thing, like when you're a company and you release developer tools, it's fine because you don't have to make money. But making money with developers is not easy because
No.
people want everything for free and people want basically all contribute. And that's totally fine that they want that. The last browser I know that was basically for payment was Opera before it became Opera 6, I think. It had
Yeah.
banners in there as well in the editor, in the browser itself.
Yeah.
And then in between, we had like Flock and a few of the browsers that were basically social media browsers and these kind of things. But it seems like that market is a very interesting one. But I don't think you want to take over the world. You just want to get enough money to come to go by and to basically live off it. And it seems like when you're what is your goal with like Polypane? Would you be excited if a company like Accenture makes it their main browser, and you have to fight 240,000 licenses tomorrow? Or what would
I
you
mean,
do then?
I do that, and I can do that. That's again, all that stuff is automated. That's the joy of being a developer. You can just build that once, and then if a company goes, I need this number of licenses, you're like, yeah, done. Um, but so like the main problem I have found with building paid tools for developers uh, is, of course, like developers get everything for free, and that's because Google and Microsoft essentially subsidize like all your tooling, which is probably another show, so we'll skip over that. But also, a lot of developers don't value their own time. Like there's of course the joke, like you can save 5 minutes looking at the README by spending 2 hours debugging in your code editor. Like, yeah, that's something like developers do every day. And it's because they don't realize that, or so maybe they get a salary and they know what they get per month, but they don't realize how that translates to what they cost their employer and how that relates to the cost of Polypane. So Polypane is roughly like 10 euros per month. If you translate that into like developer time, that's like worth 15 minutes of developer time in most of the Western world. And then if you go to America, it's even less. It's like 6 minutes on average. So the question that you should ask as a developer with all tooling is like, is this tool going to save me 6 hours per month or 6 minutes per month? And if it is, then I'm like making more money for either myself because I work for myself and I can do more and I can charge more, or for my company and then I am more valuable to them, or the company will pay for the tooling because it's good for the bottom line. But developers don't think like that. Developer thinks, well, Spotify is also like $12 or maybe it's 14 now. I haven't been keeping up, like maybe it changed again. And Spotify has all the songs in the world, so that's obviously a better deal than Polypane, which helps me code faster. And so that's the reasoning I get back. I this is like a quote from a developer, and I think that limits your own potential if you think of your time as the value of your time in that way. So I also see it as like part of the deal of Polypane is helping developers realize that their time has value and that their time has value to their employer and that they can make themselves more valuable and thus like charge more or get a better salary by being more valuable to their employer. And just that, like that entire loop, I think is also part of what I hope to achieve. Even though that's like a few steps beyond, making a living.
For sure. I think the interesting thing about what when I follow you and I see what you're doing is like you're incredibly fast in bringing out new accessibility features, and the accessibility world is basically excited about Polypane about this because
Mm-hmm.
putting these features into the main browsers, as I tried to do, is a 6 to 7 month process, and it's really
Yeah.
tough to do. But it's also great that by having a tool like that, it brings the necessity of accessibility more front and center, rather
Mm-hmm.
than just like thinking about it later on, having an audit or doing an overlay that fixes automatically
Yeah.
accessibility issues, which they don't. But I found that bringing anything in the open source in the accessibility space as a tool, we have a lot of competition of like companies that don't want change. That
Yeah.
basically, did you also feel like that? Did you get feedback about this, like where it's like, oh, yeah, it's great that you offer that, but it's not professional or whatever?
So that there's two things there. Like one is that I have like to walk a tightrope with the features I offer, where I want to make it really clear when something is wrong or something should be improved. But I also don't want to like bash developers over the head with it as they build, because then they'll just stop using Polypane because it's like the browser that always yells at them. So that's like a UI thing that I constantly have to figure out. But on the other side, like one of the things I think that makes Polypane different from most other accessibility tooling is that because I am the browser, or Polypane is the browser, and it can much more easily dig a few levels deeper, it can also tell you what you should be doing. So a lot of accessibility tooling is really negative. It's like you're doing this wrong and you're failing this rule and this is broken and this can't be used. Uh, which, like, if you do that all day, then it gets easier to deal with. But if you're a developer starting out, it's really tempting to go, well, accessibility is just not my thing and someone else can deal with it. And I'm just going to ignore it because it works on my machine. My browser doesn't complain, so it doesn't matter. Whereas if tooling says, this color contrast is wrong, but, here's the closest color to the one you are using that is valid, and you can click it to copy it into your code editor instantly, like now you've taken away like 4 or 5 steps for this particular developer, and they can make the fix and go on with their life, rather than, okay, so what is color contrast? Where do I figure out what that means? How do I need to go to a designer and complain about something? Whenever I do that, they get very, very annoyed with me, so I'd rather not talk to my design. All these things, like there's a million reasons not to do something, and most accessibility tooling doesn't take that into account. It's just like, this is wrong, and now it's your job. And it's really easy for all developers to ignore that because, they have their own browser. Browsers do a lot of work to compensate for developers' omissions, let's say. So making that feedback loop more rewarding helps a lot.
It's interesting because I don't know which browser maker actually has a developer edition anymore. Firefox used to have a developer edition, but I don't know if it's actually a thing anymore. Because I always was worried as a developer myself that having a better browser than my end users out there, like the one that ships with the operating system, the default one, I always felt like, okay, I'm getting wrong results here. I'm actually getting a better option. The same way I'm using a Google phone, so my Android is probably five times ahead of the Samsung one, kind of,
Yeah.
or the HTC one, or the other issues of it. So it feels like the worry of like not having the same experience as your end users is something that companies, and when I looked at the download numbers of the nightly editions or the preview editions, they were in the thousands for a product like Microsoft Edge. So basically, a lot of developers don't want to spend that extra time. So do you think there is a worry that like having something like Polypane gives you a wrong impression that your stuff, that you thought of everything and then the final product will be broken?
My publicist told me to say no. I mean, like there's always stuff you can miss, and there's a lot of stuff that isn't technical that you can do really, really wrong. That like a automated software tooling is just not gonna find, or AI is not gonna find, I think. Like the worry most people have with Polypane is like it is indeed like it is not Chrome. It's never like people never say, well, it's not Firefox. People always say, well, it's not Chrome and my users use Chrome, which is a problem on its own. But then the answer is like, but it is like it's literally the same version of Chromium running in Polypane, and the UI around it may be different, but the way it parses HTML, the JavaScript APIs it has available, the accessibility tree it generates, they're all identical. So that means that you don't actually have a difference there. Now, of course, using Polypane doesn't mean you never have to test Safari or Firefox or that stupid old Android phone you have in a drawer somewhere. that's still part of your job, and no desktop tool is going to fix that for you. It's just what we have to deal with. So there are things that are your responsibility as a developer, and I hope that for most developers it's their point of pride that they do that well. Polypane has tooling to make that really easy. So in Polypane I have something called Portal. If you have a local server running, you can start a portal in Polypane, and then that local server becomes available through a public URL. And then you can open it on your Android phone. You can send it to like your project manager. You can send it to the one person running Windows in your company. They can open the URL. And then anything you do in Polypane also happens on their devices. So it's still the same cohesive experience. It's just across devices. And when I say everything, that's things like scrolling, clicking, typing, but also inspecting elements, changing styles, executing commands in the console log, receiving console messages. So all of that is collected from all the devices you have connected and then shown in Polypane again. So even if you have to debug something on Android, you can stay in Polypane while doing that. And that means you don't have to set up like the developer mode on your Android phone and then connect it to Chrome Inspect and all this stuff. You just open a URL and it works. So that lowers the barrier, but it doesn't like remove the need to test Firefox, to test Safari, to test these other rendering engines.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this. This is interesting to see. There's a free trial as well in Polypane if you just want to take it for a spin. And yeah, it's interesting to see that somebody is taking on that job of like releasing a browser is a lot of work, and releasing developer tools is also very frustrating because there's lots of issues being demanded, but not much help coming from the outside. So it's great that there's alternatives out there, and I love that you actually write about these things and get people to make them more. And thanks again for the point earlier that you made about the everybody listening to this or watching this later on. Like, think about the time that you actually spend on in your environment, and sometimes like. I find this with like AI tools right now. People are like, oh, I'm so much more efficient. And you're just like, you just talked for 3 hours to a chatbot to build an interface that you could have done in half an hour as well. Like, so there's a lot of like, there's a lot of perceived performance improvements for us as developers. But it's really important to think like, how did you really spend your time and how much did that cost your employer? And in your case, it's the same person. So that's the interesting thing, that you optimized yourself and then you gave it out to the world out there.
Yeah, so that's the way what I always say is like AI is the fastest way to get to 80% of your task, but then it stops. And then you get to do the rest of the 20% without having any idea of the first 80%. So by the end, like you said, like you spent 3 hours talking to an AI for something you could have probably done in 45 minutes without one. At least that's what I've been seeing around me in terms of AI usage. Value your time. You as the developer are the expert, and that makes your time valuable, more valuable than some GPU in a server you don't control.
Well, thanks very much, Kilian. This was wonderful. So watch, this will be recorded. This is basically going to be published on our platform, and the newsletter people next week will get this. So thanks very much for your time again. Take a look at Polypane. Take a look at what Kilian has to write. It's always a pleasure to see him publishing. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.